Ah, the deportations and immigration. Listen, immigration enforcement is the process of enforcing U.S. immigration laws, primarily carried out by U.S. and Immigration Customs Enforcement, ICE, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP. It involves a range of activities, including investigating and arresting individuals who violate immigration laws and detaining and removing those who are unlawfully present in our country. This work is managed by the Department of Homeland Security and its Secretary Christian Noem, and includes efforts to address cross-border crime and secure the nation's borders. Joining us is Tyler O'Neill, managing editor of the Daily Signal. We'll always welcome him back to the broadcast. And Rosemary Jenks, I think this is her first time on the broadcast, isn't it?
It's actually the second time. It was a long time ago, though.
Well, I'm getting young, so I can't remember like I used to because I'm so young now. But you are the co-founder and policy director of the Immigration Accountability Project. So let's get into this. And I'm going to start with you, Rosemary. Why is U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement under such intense, not only debate right now, but under attack?
Well, I think it's mainly because of the rhetoric that we're hearing from the left. We have heard that, that ICE is kidnapping people and they're arresting U.S. citizens, and that they're doxing ICE agents. And I mean, all of these threats that are going on, it's just ridiculous. These folks are actually enforcing the laws that were passed by Congress. So if Democrats in Congress want to change the laws, they're welcome to try to do that. But you don't vilify the people who are actually enforcing the laws that they duly enacted.
Tyler, are there structural reforms that could make ICE more efficient and human? Are they humane enough?
Well, I think there probably is always room for some reform, but ICE is already, and if you look here, the Trump administration has intentionally gone to the mat on this issue. They have decided, with things like Alligator Alcatraz, they're trying to incentivize illegal immigrants to self-deport. So there are some ways in which ICE has taken a few flashy moves in order to encourage illegal aliens to leave on their own. And I think that is separate from these accusations we hear from Democrats who are saying that ICE is abusing its authority. And many of those accusations end up not being true. But what we're seeing here, the Trump administration has decided to deport some illegal aliens to some very negative parts of the world where you don't want to be sent. And they're doing that to send an important message, because in order to reach their targets, we're talking, the administration has set a target of 1 million deportations a year, which is incredibly aggressive, but also not really enough to reverse the essentially 10 million illegal aliens we saw enter this country under Biden. So, on the one hand, this is the most aggressive immigration enforcement we've ever seen, and yet it's probably not going to be sufficient to fully solve the issue on its own. That's one of the reasons why Trump has taken these steps to try to encourage illegal aliens who are already here already to deport themselves, because then these people can leave on their own terms, they can find their path forward, and they can avoid some of the unfortunate results of being rounded up by immigration and customs enforcement and then deported by the federal government.
Rosemary, what about the roles of the media and elected officials pushing this distorted narrative about ICE?
Yeah, that's where most of the trouble comes from. That's what is encouraging and incentivizing these attacks on ICE officers and on Border Patrol agents, is that the Democrats in Congress feel powerless because they lost the election. The people voted to deport illegal aliens in electing President Trump. He campaigned on this. It's no secret that he was going to do this when he took office. And they've lost power, and they hate that. And they're actually encouraging violence, and the rhetoric is just disgusting. And the media is picking it all up and, making false claims about US citizens being arrested. And I'll tell you, the only US citizens being arrested by ICE or the Border Patrol are US citizens who are actually violently attacking ICE officers and Border Patrol agents. They're obstructing justice. And yes, they're being arrested for that, as they should be. I don't know when we started thinking it's okay to attack law enforcement. It's not. That has to end.
Tyler, obviously, if you look at these protesters and the attacks, these organized protests are infiltrated, and obviously that is also causing the situation to escalate. There are other
Yes.
agendas going on here.
So what we're seeing here, and this is one of the reasons why the Trump administration has decided to go after Antifa. And to be clear, Antifa is a very disorganized, generally, organization. All these people who are engaging in the violent riots. What usually happens is you have a protest organized by a 501c3 nonprofit, or at least helps in some way by a nonprofit organization. That protest then has Antifa elements there, whether intentionally or not. That's an open question, and I think that's something investigators have to look into. But then the protest is mostly peaceful, and then some elements of those protesters, then, either they're Antifa that's embedded, or it's people who then decide to become violent. Whatever the actual truth is, and this changes based on on the actual situation on the ground. But then these people engage in violent attacks against law enforcement, against, often it's property attacks. So they'll go to, as we saw in 2020, the courthouse in Portland, where they would constantly be throwing Molotov cocktails, setting off fireworks, engaging in violent attacks. And to be clear, many on the left act as though this isn't real violence because it's against either enforcement, or it's against buildings, or it's against, in one case in Atlanta, construction equipment. But the Trump administration is looking into trying to follow the money and see if those who are funding the NGOs that created these protests that then led to this violence, if they have any intention on supporting Antifa, if their goals are this destabilization and promoting this violence. And of course, reaching a conviction on these things is going to be very difficult. But I think the Trump administration is sending the message that this is not acceptable. We saw this really escalate in 2020, but we've seen these actions continue here and there. And in 2023 in Atlanta, there was a violent Molotov cocktail riot where a Southern Poverty Law Center attorney got arrested. And this just shows how mainstream some of these violent actors can be.
Rosemary, do calls to defund or abolish ICE overlook the practical realities of border enforcement and what they fight every day? And what would reinvented ICE actually look like in practice?
Well, the calls to abolish ICE are just absurd. You don't abolish law enforcement when you have a massive violation of federal law. There is no other agency or organization that is dedicated to enforcing immigration law. So what the Democrats are actually saying when they call for abolishing ICE is to abolish our immigration laws altogether. They want open borders. They want anyone to be able to come here and give them free handouts and assume that they'll vote for Democrats in the future. That is not what the American people want. You can, talk about re-envisioning ICE, but what they're actually, proposing is nonsensical. They've done this with the police departments too, when they say, we're going to send mental health workers out to respond to domestic violence cases. Well, and then the mental health workers get attacked and killed. It's just not logical to try to remove law enforcement from a law enforcement role. We have immigration laws. We're a nation of the rule of law, and we need to enforce those laws. And just because Donald Trump, for the first time in at least in most people's lifetimes, is enforcing immigration laws, they're flipping out and saying, oh no, we can't have this. It's just absurd.
You know, Rosemary makes an excellent point, Tyler, when you look at where we are in this administration. It's interesting how shifting political priorities influences ICE's perception, the operations from one administration to the next. And so, and then the question begs of itself, is the role that local law enforcement playing in federal immigration enforcement?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So we've had a spectrum, as we saw during the Biden administration, when the federal government decided not to really enforce immigration law. You had Texas creating barbed wire fencing to essentially have some sort of effort to prevent illegal immigration. And, that was challenged by the administration at the time because the administration said, and I mean, this is where it gets dicey, like, yes, the federal government has the role of enforcing immigration law, but if the federal government is not going to, does that mean that state governments can? On the other side of the aisle, you have many cities that have declared, I mean, sometimes they don't like this term, but they are effectively sanctuary cities where they say we are not going to work with ICE, and there are whole states that say this. They say local and state law enforcement are not going to cooperate with ICE in enforcing immigration law. And essentially what you have there is a repeat of the sort of nullification efforts we saw before the Civil War. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying we're going to see another civil war because of this, but I am saying that this is an echo in American history where you had states and localities essentially saying, no, we are not going to follow the law. And on an issue like immigration, I mean, this is an inherently federal issue. So on the one hand, I'm glad to see when states will want to enforce the law when the federal government isn't. But at the same time, this is fundamentally a federal issue. I'm glad to see the Trump administration taking it seriously. I would pray that if there was another Democratic administration like Joe Biden's, they might take it seriously. But based on what we see from that party over and over again, I think they would probably go even further than Biden did in not enforcing these laws.
You know, Rosemary, there's just such an overwhelming number of videos on TikTok, on Instagram. You know, it's so fascinating. They rarely put ICE in a good light. It's always showing this brutality, tossing some woman on the cement. You never really show what happens before the actual law enforcing of the law, and it plays in the minds of young people like you will never know, because they have such empathy for anything except ICE because they feel they can do no good. In fact, they will tell you they've never seen any good that has come from ICE's enforcement. So when we come back, I want you to talk about, as we go to break, how do you balance? Really want you to think about this question: compassion for migrants with respect for U.S. sovereignty and the rule of law. So, Rosemary, balance that sovereignty with compassion.
Well, Tyler brought up sanctuary cities. And the fact is that most of the videos that we're seeing that have violence are in sanctuary cities. And the reason for that is that the way ICE normally operates is that it actually goes into local jails and it identifies illegal aliens in the jails and it takes them directly from the jail. So everybody knows they're unarmed. They're not in a community where other people can gather around and threaten law enforcement and so on. So it's a very peaceful transition where ICE takes these criminal aliens from the jails and then removes them. That can't happen in sanctuary cities because sanctuary cities refuse to let ICE into the jails. So the alternative is that ICE has to go out into the community and, they identify a criminal alien. They go out into the community to find the alien. The alien may be armed or may not be armed. So the ICE officers are on, extra vigilant because they don't know what they're going to be facing. The alien may have other family members or, friends and neighbors and so on in the house with him or her that may also be armed. So it's a much more dangerous situation. It also puts at risk those aliens who are with the target alien, because if they're here illegally, they're going to be arrested too. Whereas if ICE were going into the jail, that wouldn't be the case. So essentially, these sanctuary jurisdictions have brought this on themselves by forcing ICE into dangerous situations where they have to go into the community. And the result then is that neighbors gather around and threaten ICE enforcement officers. And the alien may or may not be armed, may or may not resist arrest. And let's face it, if you're an American citizen and you resist arrest, you're going to be roughed up because you're going to be brought down and handcuffed and taken in. The same is absolutely true of illegal aliens. If they resist arrest, they're putting themselves and the officers in danger. So there is a much more peaceful way to do this, but not in a sanctuary jurisdiction. That's the fundamental lesson that these folks like Governor Pritzker and Governor Newsom just haven't grasped yet.
Excellent insights, by the way. Tyler, why are more states asserting authority over immigration enforcement? And do these states' actions challenge or, I won't say complement the federal power, does it take away from it?
Well, in some situations, states are complementing the federal power and enforcement. I mean, I think of Florida and the example of the whole Alligator Alcatraz incident, where you have a governor who's very willing to support and help the administration. But in other states, I mean, most of the states that are being aggressive right now are the Democratic states, where governors and attorneys general are trying to make a case for themselves by going against Trump in any way that they can. Because there was this moment after the 2024 election, there was a brief honeymoon period where we saw many on the left starting to ask, well, maybe we were wrong. Maybe we should re-examine our priors and engage with this movement that President Trump represents. And since after, I think after DOJ, after some of the actions that the administration has taken and the way that the legacy media and the NGOs that support unfettered immigration have been twisting the story to demonize the Trump administration, we've now seen the Democrats reverting to form, acting as though President Trump is illegitimate and doing almost everything they can to prevent the enforcement of federal immigration law. And so that's why you're seeing a lot of these lawsuits, many Democrat attorneys general joining with some of the unions and left-wing activist groups like the ACLU, groups I wrote about in my book, The Woktopus, the dark money cabal manipulating the federal government, that really pulled the strings in the Biden administration. Now they're fighting outside the government to push against the Trump administration's enforcement of immigration law. And immigration has really become one of the central battles of this administration, and I think will continue to be so. I do think that the Trump administration is positioning itself in a way that the American people generally agree with. I mean, we talk about compassion for immigrants, compassion for those who are really struggling. The American people are a big-hearted people, but that doesn't mean that we don't also care about justice and about our sovereignty as a nation. We have laws that allow for a lot of legal immigration, and I think that is a good thing. But I also think we have to be clear, if your first act in coming to this country is to thumb your nose at our country and essentially say you are not going to give us the dignity of trying to come here legally, then we are not obligated to give you the dignity of treating you like we would a legal immigrant.
You know, Rosemary, it is fascinating how recent court rulings are redefining the limits of state involvement.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think that some of those court cases will be overturned. Some of them will stand depending on which way they're going. But, in general, the supremacy clause of the Constitution means that, and the court has upheld, that states can go as far as, but no further than, the federal government in federal law where the federal government has supremacy.
Let me stop you a minute, because I think you're alluding to the fact that there are serious risks that arise when states craft their own immigration policies.
That's absolutely right. And, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense that the Constitution actually puts immigration directly in the hands of Congress because when an immigrant comes into a state, that state can't keep the immigrant within the borders of the state. The immigrant is free to travel anywhere in the United States. So it has to be a national issue. Otherwise, you'd have, states bringing in massive numbers of people, and then those people could move to other states and, whether or not that other state wanted them. And so that's the real question is, it has to be a national policy because we don't restrict people moving around within the United States. And it's also, remember, primarily an economic policy. Immigration is about labor and jobs. So if we are in a situation, as we were at the turn of the last century, where we have an entire frontier to develop, then immigration should be higher, and we may be a little bit more lax about what the rules are for entering the country. But when we have a labor market that is putting Americans in harm, which we do right now, then we have to be more careful. And Americans realize that not only are they competing for jobs, they're competing for resources, whether it's welfare resources, education resources, healthcare resources, all of it, with a larger pool of people because of this massive illegal immigration under the Biden administration, to say nothing of the fact that, as Tyler mentioned, we have an extraordinarily generous legal immigration system that lets in more than 1 million people every year, which in my view is too high at the moment, but that's another debate. But certainly illegal aliens come at the bottom of the pool in terms of our willingness as Americans to share our needed resources.
This is such a good conversation, by the way. So educational and so informative. Tyler, how might cooperation, or let's say conflict, between levels of our government affect border security? And are there states filling a leadership vacuum left by Washington, D.C.?
Well, there were under the previous administration. I think that we saw Texas, developing that barbed wire fencing. That was a very strong statement that, no, we are going to try to follow the law, even if the federal government won't. Right now, though, the large development is on the other side of the issue, where you have these states taking it upon themselves to oppose the enforcement of immigration law. And that's pretty noxious. I mean, as Rosemary mentioned, you can't really have a bifurcated, 50-state approach to immigration because we don't restrict travel inside the United States. And I really don't want the United States to restrict travel between the states. I think that is a good development in our country. But when you have, these sanctuary states that are saying we support unfettered immigration and want to kick the administration to the curb, you're essentially having them trying to create their own sort of sovereignty against the sovereignty of the United States. And that's going to raise serious problems. I mean, more than just the specific problems of ICE being unable to enforce the law in as safe a manner as possible, as Rosemary rightly mentioned. But also, when they go to the courts, there are other issues there. There are issues of who's getting arrested, who's not getting arrested, and there are fundamental battles. I mean, we've seen judges, and one of the things I talk about is, I like to say, the line between woke and based cuts through most institutions in the United States today. And you see that really strongly in churches, even in denominations that lean either conservative or liberal. You'll often find that there are churches that support one side or the other, and there's conflict there. These are ideological worldview debates, and few issues are as practical where it comes to showing what happens due to this worldview divide than immigration.
Let me piggyback on what you're saying. So, Rosemary, in the little time that we have left, under a minute and a half, how do constitutional principles like the Supremacy Clause play into this debate?
Well, I mean, we have laws on the books that govern who can come into the United States and who cannot. We have laws on the books saying, what process the people who broke those laws get in our court system. A lot of that's being ignored by various activist judges. We're going to get to a point where I hope, where the Supreme Court of the United States is going to lay down the law and say, no, this is a congressional issue. Congress has written the laws, Congress has enacted the laws, the president has signed the laws, and the laws are going to be enforced regardless of whether you activist judges like it. We have a ways to go before we get there. I mean, we have all kinds of questions that are going to be before the court.
Well, listen, that's an understatement. Rosemary, Tyler, thank you for such a civil, reasonable, and thought-provoking discussion. I look forward to having you both back.